Well, all right, folks, welcome to Nostalgia Trap. David Parsons here with my good friend Justin Rogers Cooper. How you doing, Justin?
I'm doing pretty well for having my mind broken by this documentary we're going to talk about today.
Getting your mind broken by a disturbing documentary seems like a hallmark of this show. I wanted to bring, and I think both of us, it's actually you that brought this documentary to my attention, but I wanted to bring it to the attention of Nostalgia Trap listeners because I think it will be of deep interest to the sort of folks that are drawn to this show. It's called American Conspiracy: The Octopus Murders. So, yeah, this movie is about ostensibly the alleged suicide of a journalist named Danny Casolaro, who died in 1991 in a hotel room in West Virginia under mysterious circumstances while he was investigating this thing that he called the Octopus Conspiracy, which was, as the name might indicate, it's a sort of a multi-tentacled conspiracy theory that reaches into a lot of the territories that you and I, Justin, have talked about on this show, and I know have been of deep interest to anyone who's into, like, I don't know, a certain brand of post-war, Cold War, 20th century, all somehow related to the JFK assassination type conspiracies. But this film also, and I think this is part of what makes it appealing, is it also works on many levels and is in part about, like many documentaries of this kind, are about like the investigators themselves and how the journalists get drawn into a particular frame of reality and a frame of mind while they're investigating this stuff. And you and I think, deeply recognize that trope or that archetype, a certain kind of white dude that like gets sucked down the rabbit hole of thinking he's going to find the answer to everything. And that movie kind of covers that territory too. So I really recommend this movie, and there's lots to talk about. Thanks for recommending it, Justin.
My pleasure. Yeah, I mean it's four episodes. Each one is about an hour long. So it's bingeable, but it's also digestible over time. It took me, I think, a week or two to get through it. And it's nice in the two ways that you just discussed. One, if you go back to our JFK show, you know that we're interested in sort of the incomplete stories and also the crazy stories that are told about the kind of mid to late 20th century intelligence community. And we never claimed to have any answers to it. And I think, thankfully, we've never become too obsessed by those stories. But as children born in the late 20th century, I think there is an aspect of the nostalgia trap, both to our desire to learn more about these weird, sort of complex true crime fictions. And also, it taps into our interest in politics and what some people call, from various angles, the deep state or deep statelets
Hmm.
that sort of machinate and organize not just kind of the U.S. political economy, but sort of help to shape at the margins, like kind of U.S. popular cultural reality, if you will. And for that, I would send listeners back to the review of the Manson book that we did a few years
Chaos.
ago. Chaos. Yeah, thank you. And one of the things to say at the outset as we like try to track our way in here is to just observe what you just said, and that is to kind of note that when you start telling these stories, you end up uh, uh, speaking about the way stories are told as much as the fact finding or the truths of the stories themselves, because the stories are kind of impossible to verify at some level, and there are just enough facts to corroborate the existence of the characters and some acts, and they're usually coming out of criminal cases like murder, like Danny. But it's hard to verify or access the truth of anything else. And so there's a scene at the end of the doc, and I'll give it back to you, David, where the the guy who's investigating Danny, this guy Christian, who's kind of like becoming Danny,
So
and
creepy.
and it's the documentary is kind of about how does he stop himself from becoming Danny, and or by turn, how do we stop ourselves from from going too far down our rabbit holes? And one of the things he says into the camera that I thought was memorable is he was like, I'm beginning to realize that everyone in this story is insane. And he kind of laughs in a crazy way. And then he goes, it is so sad and it's so fucked. And I think that that is actually a good place to set the scene, if you
Yeah.
will.
Yeah. He gives the Joker laugh, the sort of like knowing, nihilistic sort of I've gone over to the other side. It's again very recognizable. And it's the that mystery, that sort of unsolvability of it. That sort of like seems like the narrative engine of like so much of like what we call true crime, but also like QAnon and like conspiracy. Like we'll never is it really Q? Did we? Yeah, there you go. Crossing the Rubicon, Michael C. Rupert. That's one of the guys that really got us started on like the whole rabbit hole of like connecting global like oil politics to 9/11 and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, I guess 9/11 was the entryway for us, but you're right. I think there definitely is like a nostalgia for a particular kind of Cold War espionage. And like when I get into the same characters, like, oh, now we're talking about Nixon and like the Nixon and Watergate and how we're,
Bush.
yeah, George H.W. Bush showing up in so much of this. Like that part of it is incredible, honestly. But it's not something I haven't heard already, that like
Mm-hmm.
sort of Texas connection. But let's get into like a little bit of what this movie is actually about because this dude, Christian, is it Christian Hansen? Is that his name?
I think so.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The main sort of like journalist who's just a dude, and I think that's part of why I think he's like they show like Brooklyn a lot. They actually show Ventura in this movie, which is an odd connection. Yeah, several
Oh.
times. Um, but either way, like this guy's just like a very recognizable guy if you've been around like, graduate school in the 2000s. Like a kind of like Arcade Fire type of guy, if that rings any bells. So either way, he gets into this story and like the story of this the entryway is this suicide or alleged suicide of this journalist named Danny Casolaro in 1991 in West Virginia in a hotel room. And it doesn't really look like a suicide. The guy's wrists are slashed violently. There's like blood everywhere, plastic bag over his head. The scene is really gruesome. And it feels like, wow, he had just told his brother, and this is a key detail, just a couple weeks earlier that he was on the trail of some big, giant revelations about this conspiracy and that he was about to meet some people that were going to tell him everything and that were going to like reveal the wizard behind the curtain sort of thing. And then he also said, if there's an accident and something happens to me, it's not an accident, just so you know. And like him cryptically saying that and then dying by mysterious circumstances in this odd suicide just a couple weeks later is what led a lot of people, especially his family and friends, to be like, no way. There's no way this guy killed himself. He must have been murdered. It must have been connected to all the things that he was finding out. So that's the sort of entryway into this journalist that's our age, I guess, or close to our age, who sort of like gets into the murder or suicide of this journalist and starts taking all of his investigations seriously and starts getting into the octopus conspiracy itself. And there's a lot going on with this octopus conspiracy, but the general idea is that the octopus is that there's eight dudes that are like, and George H.W. Bush is one of them. Howard Hunt is one of them. Some recognizable figures, some not, and sort of profile everybody. But these eight dudes are sort of like the back shadow X-Files dark room sort of conspiracy that have been in control of a lot of major global events in the United States and otherwise, as they sort of like get involved in tech and get involved in oil, and Iran Contra shows up here, JFK murder shows up here. A lot of the sort of connections to big things that we've talked about show up here. But that's a sort of outline of what this movie is about.
Yeah, and it's worth. Let me stress a couple things. One, it's kind of clear from the notes of Danny Casolaro, Danny's notes, that when he was trying to come up with the title, the octopus, which is his phrase, he was saying 12, he was saying 6. There's something almost arbitrary about these 8. And it's a marketing strategy as much as anything else. And so it's not that I don't want the listener to think that it's this group of 8 is the deep state. It's not asserting that. It's saying that there is essentially a rogue network of what you might loosely call intelligence operatives who function across agencies, from the National Security Council, which was the one that surprised me most. We can go back to that, to CIA, to FBI, to some private corporations like the Wackenhut Corporation, which is a private security firm that we can say more about. That's a trip to Google, by the way. These guys, if not in control of major world events, can be seen to have like a finger on the scales of various political events, from the Reagan election, maybe to the savings and loan scandal of the 80s, to any number of various events that don't register, like a sequence of unsolved murders up and down California, that one guy was implicated in and never charged. All the charges would always be dropped in a very Manson chaos kind of style government layer of protection. So
Let
part
me
of what
just
he's
pause
trying,
on that
yeah,
one because that was the detail that popped out to me, and I don't know if we'll get back to it, but that little one, that like CIA hitman that was sort of a serial killer on the California coast,
mm-hmm.
I had not heard that name. I think his name is Pearson. And yeah, he was involved in like all these robberies, rapes, murders. And what I thought was the key detail is there's this, a character in this documentary named Michael Riconosciuto,
I think,
who
yeah, it was Philip Arthur Thompson.
Philip Arthur Thompson. There you go, not
Yeah, just
Pearson.
want to make sure
Yeah,
yeah.
Philip Arthur Thompson, if you want to look that up. But one of their key one of Danny's key sources is this shady figure named Michael Riconosciuto, who is always like he's a figure who's always spouting a whole lot of different like stuff that sounds like bullshit. And one of the things he says is that like, oh, this guy Thompson, he like killed like 15 people in California and got away with all of it. And they were like, they didn't believe him. They were like, that's just one of the bullshit things that he said. And then later they went and researched it, and they found like 15 different murders in California in which Thompson was like the central figure, the central suspect of like beating women to death, all sorts of fucked up grisly shit. And the story was always the same, that like the FBI or other authorities had intervened and like let him go. And all these like cops, local cops, are sitting there like going like, what the fuck? And they're pissed because they solved a murder, and yet the guy's let go because like the X-Files smoking man shows up essentially and says no, he's good, and lets him go. And like that's very chaos. That's very Manson murder type shit.
Yeah, and we'll get back to the smoking man, because he's actually a literal smoking man, who is one of the guys that's running this particular CIA cell that Danny stumbled onto, that they spend most of the documentary on. And the smoking man is Robert Booth Nichols. And
That
he's
guy's
like,
so scary.
he's kind of like a demented version of the guy who's like, I don't drink, but when I drink, it's Dos Equis. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if that's the ad, but he has a real international man of intrigue aspect. But just to cut back though, about this Philip Arthur Thompson, and going all the way back to Danny and his investigation, I do think that there's something, once you get beyond the marketing aspect of what's called the octopus. The octopus is really a metaphor for this kind of network of power brokers who uh, are kind of running guys like Thompson, like the guy who was never charged with all these murders. They're running all these cells, and that a lot of the cells are profit-making entities, and I think that's what's kind of interesting. And that the kind of common piece throughout it all isn't just the way that what we're stumbling into is related to, for example, Iran Contra, which seems to be the major thing that this particular octopus or tentacle of the octopus was involved with. That's like, to me, the most verifiable aspect of what we see. But that these profit making entities, including the one that was, selling drugs essentially and laundering money to produce weapons for the Contras. That's what this cell in California was doing at the Cabazon Indian Casino Reservation. Which was itself a pioneering little financial experiment and political experiment of its time that Michael Riconosciuto is involved in. But part of what is going on here is that these agency operations cannot be funded by Congress. That's the part we all know. We all know that story, is that black operations cannot have the money allocated by Congress, or at least could not at this time, for any number of reasons, but specifically in the 80s because the Reagan administration was uh, had their hands tied after the Church Committee and after the 70s revelations of things like Chaos, et cetera, MK Ultra, et cetera. After that period, Congress wouldn't approve a lot of these kind of clandestine black operations that were illegal and also kind of immoral and overthrowing governments and et cetera. It's stuff that this audience is probably familiar with. But what makes this kind of one step further down into the pit is that it really starts to show you that these profit generating enterprises were sort of surrounded by like a bunch of creepy characters. Like imagine your coworkers at these like off the books businesses. And that's who a lot of these people that Danny found are. And that's who Christian and the team ends up interviewing in some cases. Is guys like Michael Riconosciuto. Like who are the people that are involved with this kind of like work? And then the other kind of, I think, aspect of it is that rather than really be a conspiracy theory that's sort of saying major world events are orchestrated by this cabal of the Secret Eight, it's also kind of like more articulating that this kind of rogue network of operatives, it does extend into the Reagan White House, but not necessarily in order to shape world events. It's sort of an enrichment exercise that part of the they say this at one point, but part of the national interest rhetoric that's being used as a mask here isn't to say we're making a world safe for capitalism in general. It's saying we're making the world safe for our pocketbooks in particular. That they're it's class rule. It's waspy guys. It's OSS dudes. It's old boy network guys who come from these like kind of white privilege families of bankers and war veterans and shit like that. But
Guys who golf.
yeah, but guys who golf and slit throats. You know what I mean? Like it's a weird type, and kind of bring their kids up through this whole machine. But it's kind of like it's class reproduction on a certain level, and by extension on a level it's racial reproduction too, to a certain degree. But it's how does power reproduce itself using agencies of the state. But it's filling in cracks, if you will. Like what I like about this is the novelistic detail. This is like a noir film.
Yeah.
This isn't a cascading global conspiracy that leads to a group of people who are all pulling the strings. No, we're getting like some of the cracks filled in on Iran Contra. We're getting some of the details, some of the faces, some of the names. I think that's the value here, but that's also the nostalgia trap, if you will, or one of them.
Yeah, and there's a danger to an ordinary person touching this octopus, touching this conspiracy, and like digging too deep into it. And like the danger that this film identifies is more than one, right? There's the danger from actually touching the conspiracy, but there's also the danger to like losing your sanity because you'll like the truth is always slipping through your fingers. You're always, I mean, there are so many moments in this film where the contradictions sort of drive people crazy because they can't find that like one specific answer. And there's even like several friends of Danny Casolaro who are like, yeah, he took on this sort of like arrogant personality at some point where he was like, oh, I feel sorry for the people that don't know what I know. You know, I feel sorry for people that don't understand. And you start to understand that like part of the danger of getting into the conspiracy is, yeah, touching it and it may be like them coming after you. But there's also just the personal sort of danger of like losing your mind and losing contact with what's important in life and that sort of thing. And that was a nice touch on the film, actually. I thought that that part was is rarely considered, and it's something that I think going back to Michael C. Rupert, you and I talked about a lot. I mean, Rupert's life ended in tragedy. He committed suicide in the midst of a lot of like ugly scandals and shit like that, and it just felt like he had fallen deep into sort of, I don't know, drinking his own Kool-Aid sort of thing. And you and I, having been around a lot of like, I don't know, people who are watching too many Adam Curtis movies, you end up sort of like being looking for the mega narrative. And I say this as someone who himself watches too many Adam Curtis movies and looks for the mega narrative because it's really romantic. And I think that this movie is interesting because it sort of shows both sides. Like, part of what's compelling about this is that the octopus, it might not be like the secret eight controlling all things, but the people he was dealing with were seriously dangerous people who were willing to do all sorts of shit. And yeah, I believe could like pull off murders, fake suicides, all that kind of dirty shit. So there is a real danger. I mean, I'll tell you this. I wouldn't want to get involved with CIA shit and like researching the CIA this little tidbit, like as a historian. When I was in the PhD program at a CUNY Graduate Center, we had like a guy come that had written a lot of books. I forget who it was. I can find the name. He'd written a lot of books on the FBI, and he was like, "Dude, I warn you against doing research on the CIA and like digging deep. Every historian that's done it has regretted it. It's sort of like it's the rabbit hole. You know what I mean? And that rabbit hole can drag you into some weird, dark places. It just makes me think that like all of it does have a certain mystique to it. It's like there's a shadow network, and we think the CIA has something to do with it, or is it? And that part of it, I think, gets a lot of people. Obviously, that's why there's a Netflix documentary about it.
It's also, it's a weird realm of political knowledge that people like to compartmentalize, and within the academy too. Uh, Beyond the rabbit hole, like work on the CIA has to be done very carefully, because if you come across as like not necessarily even a lazy scholar, but if you come across as someone who hasn't dotted every I or crossed every T, because you're already working on a topic that people have skepticism about as like a credible topic, because how can you know something about a subject that's trying to make itself unknown, or trying to subvert the process of knowing it?
Yeah, one of the
How do
CIA
you?
guys tells him, "You haven't done enough work to deserve to know that." Basically,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and so imagine what academics think. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
who's the committee going to take? So there are great books on the CIA, and then there's probably a lot of really bad ones. And if you're going for tenure, there are easier ways to produce the kind of book that would get you tenure within the academy. One window into this, there's a couple little stories that we might want to just tell people to illustrate some of this, is that Casolaro, Danny, he gets sucked in by a story that was already in the news. And this was the story of the Inslaw Corporation and this Promise software. And what's cool about this story, because it's wild, Half of it's probably not true. Even the stuff I'm going to tell you in a minute here, David, is from the Rupert book, because Rupert
Does he
has
talk about Promise?
pages on Promise. Dude. That's
No
where I first
shit.
learned about Promise. The reason this documentary stuck out to me is because it was sort of beginning there, and I already knew about Promise, but I hadn't reread this Rupert stuff in 20 years. It's wild tales. And so
Hmm.
what happened was in the early 80s, after Reagan's Justice Department sort of comes to power, and now they're the game in town. Like the Justice Department essentially stole this Promise software from a guy named Bill Hamilton, who's the CEO of Inslaw Corporation and the guy that kind of writes the original code. It's really early computer code. Like it's early 80s code that was like super valuable. And remember, at this time, like the Echelon program and other like NSA level computer programs are sort of cutting edge. But in the early 80s, the kind of computerization of databases for like regular police forces much less the FBI. All that stuff is still, in its beginning stages. It's there, but it's at the beginning. Remember, DNA doesn't even become a real thing till later in the 80s in terms of its widespread use for catching criminals. So the 80s is this really interesting time of technological innovation within law enforcement. But it's also, another way to put it is, it's an interesting time for the creation of digital surveillance in agencies that were analog. And so this is that moment. And in the middle of this moment, you have like a piratical theft of the software. And so this guy Hamilton goes public and sort of says, these assholes at the Justice Department stole my shit, and it's worth about $6 million, and they're not even giving me the 6 million. And part of it, that the thing that we all thought that was said then too was, why don't they just pay him for it? You know what I mean? They could pay him off, but it was a real fuck you attitude to this guy Hamilton. It was almost personal. It was basically saying, we're the bullies on the block, and we can act with impunity because we're the Justice Department. We are the cops. We're the nation's police. We're in charge of the fucking FBI. So fuck you. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it was a real fuck you attitude, which tells you a lot about these guys. Okay, so fine. Now here's where Danny's trail leads, and this has been corroborated by Sherry Seymour, who's the one who's in the documentary starting in, I think, the third or fourth episode, and she's wrote the only real book on this subject that's called The Last Circle, and she kind of finishes what Danny started. She's a real interesting woman, a real interesting author. But here's what gets corroborated is that, and then I'll tell you where the thing stops, and this is, and I'll let you jump in just 1 second. But where it goes is, of all people, Michael Riconosciuto, who's the danger man, the guy who's in basically all four of these episodes.
Yeah.
This kind of big, greasy dude who comes from,
he looks like a Robert Crumb character.
Yeah, he also looks like the Penguin from Batman,
Yeah.
but like a different version. I'm not trying to be mean either. That's kind of what he looks like to me. And he is this technological prodigy. This is a dude that can design weapons. He knows computer code. He invented, when he was a teenager, a parallel telephone network in his neighborhood, and like demonstrated it. He was, people, physics professors from Stanford were like appraising this guy when he was, about to go to college, being like, this is a serious intellectual, serious inventor kind of guy. This guy is given, in theory, the promised software, and he's told to create back doors into the software. Now, this software was being used and sold by law enforcement agencies because it was basically like a very smart way of organizing crimes and criminals and cases, but it could track criminals and cases across these different databases. And the Justice Department got it inside of its head, and it might not just be justice here. Remember that these guys are connected across agencies, to start selling it to other countries for use by their federal policing, because with the back door, then they would have access to, in theory, all these fucking cases and intelligence files going on around the world, Israel, Canada, etc. And
to me, that was such a incredible detail, but also like so like Tom and Jerry, sort of cartoonish, and sort of like, oh, we'll sell you the surveillance software, and of course we have our own connection to it, and we can like spy on what they're spying on. It seems so obvious in retrospect, like a scheme, and yet this is what the U.S. government is up to, using these shadowy figures to like hijack the software, sell it all around the world. And it tells you how powerful the software was. I mean, it's basically, prior to this software, if a police department arrested someone, they had to sort of like you said, have an analog system for finding out who this person was, where they're from, what crimes they may have been convicted of or picked up for in the past. It was sort of a, get on the phone and talk to some other sheriff somewhere type of deal. This, I mean, if you could imagine, is like Googling someone, and you can find this John Smith that you've arrested and find out that he's got a trail all across the country and eventually the world. It's incredibly powerful software. And yeah, the back door to it is how we are spying in other countries. And that part of it, I was like, okay, I'm on board with all of it. It all makes sense.
And you put it really well. It's search before search. It's search 25 years before Google, and it's search through precious databases that are law enforcement and security related databases by governments. Now, the other thing it can do is, I thought of this. I don't know if this was explicitly stated in the movie or the documentary, but one thing you quickly learn about these guys is that, like with Thompson, the kind of serial killer who is let off because he's a quote unquote FBI informant and a CIA asset, that California killer guy, is that a lot of your assets are being pulled through law enforcement channels all over the world all the time. So it would also become a way to keep track of your guys. You would know when your guys were arrested or when your guys were processed, maybe when they went through passport, when they went through customs. Any time that those guys had a run-in somewhere, you could keep track of them. So it was also a surveillance operation for your black ops army in a certain kind of sense.
It's all that
It was
Jason Bourne shit.
it is. And it was, well, exactly, because it was also a way to, because as we know from Jason Bourne, and as we know from this documentary from Shudo, a lot of times your assets flip. And who are they flipping to? Where are they located? So if you have a flipping asset in law enforcement, even if you don't give a shit about 99% of the data that's coming back to you, the 1% of the data that is coming back to you, if you can locate a guy who you thought was on your side and he's now playing for the other team, and you know that he's in that prison, hey, let's start making phone calls. Let's shut that shit down before it gets even further. That kind of fucking software would be so goddamn valuable before you even get to the Ruperts of the world, who have even more grandiose claims about this. So in the psychological warfare sense of this, David, can I just dose you and our audience here with just a little bit of the Rupert on Promise?
Yeah, please.
Dude, I'm not going to give you 20 pages. I'm going to give you 20 words. I'm going to
What
give
does
you
he
less than a
say?
page. All right. So and listen to the language here, because this is from his, from the Wilderness newsletter that he originally had sent
God, I
out.
used to read that every day,
September
honestly.
2000, dude.
Yeah.
So we're going back 24 years right here.
Jesus.
And here's what he says. This is about Promise. It was able to simultaneously read and integrate any number of different computer programs or databases simultaneously. Stop. It's a meta software program. So it goes beyond the criminal justice orientation we've just described. Now, this could be false, but the claim here is that this was an Uber system that could integrate other systems inside of its data and transmit that data back to a source. So regardless of the language in which the original programs have been written. Okay. So then it says,
Panopticon.
yeah, right. It's something out of the movies that you see in the movies all the time now. It's the Uber code. It's the source code. And so then he kind of talks about, okay, no, here we go. This is the good stuff. Okay, this information, according from Tyree, who's like his source, William Tyree, that he recorded in a phone conversation. This is August 28th, 2000. The research work on quote unquote block modeling social research theory. Okay, and what did Tyree uncover through this theory? Tyree described an actual physical point in space further out than even thought possible and now used by U.S. satellites. This distance is made possible by Promise progeny so evolved they make the original software look primitive. The social research, which included pioneering mathematical work, apparently facilitating the creation of artificial intelligence. Now, remember, this book is pre-AI hoopla of the stuff we're thinking about now. This is 80s or 90s AI. Okay, so all right, I'll keep reading. And it's hard to understand, but I just want you to get the breathless tone. Postulated that a similar remote hypothetical position would eliminate randomness from all human activity, blah, 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 blah. Everything would be visible in terms of measurable and predictable patterns, the ultimate big picture. So what you take from all that,
The algorithm.
yeah, is that like in the last Tom Cruise Mission Impossible movie, it's the supercomputer that can understand the probabilities of all events that are taking place online and sort of map and design the future, mostly so that it could predict economic crises and financial crises, so you could short certain stocks and make money if you have the software, because the software was like a giant probability matrix. Okay, none of it might be true, but that's what Rupert is saying about this software. And keep in mind, the documentary doesn't make these claims about Promise. The documentary says that there's psychological warfare involved from all of these witnesses and characters, so that they're always just telling you partial truths. So I don't know how much
this
Rupert
reminds
got
me-
sucked into something here. You know what I mean?
Yeah, this is sending me into the world of living in one of the first apartments I lived in New York in Washington Heights. and being on my laptop all the time, reading Rupert stuff, but also reading about like, do you remember these like spider bots I was telling you about for a while? Do you remember this?
Yeah.
These were like, it was a computer program that essentially read probabilities and took all of human history and sort of like read the probabilities of things happening in the future and sort of like wrote the future with the past.
Yeah.
And it would predict things like specific things. And so I remember I used to text you and be like, "Oh, the spider bots are predicting like a mega event." You know,
Oh yeah.
you remember this? Yeah.
Yeah.
We were these guys in this conspiracy movie. You know what I mean? Like we were definitely
We
at this.
still are.
Yeah, we still are, I guess. Yeah. Sitting here being like the bots, because these bots, I mean, at those, we were at this point, it was sort of a fringe online sort of conspiracy theory, but the algorithm sort of is these bots. Like the algorithm is there to sort of, as we've seen with like that documentary Social Dilemma, it's there to like kind of scoop up all human activity and basically like monetize predictions,
Exactly.
like monetize, like they said, oh, Justin likes cars. We've seen that from his Instagram. Therefore, we can predict how long his eyes will stay on this ad, and we can sell that as a package to like some like corporation. It's insane, and yet that's what this movie is sort of touching on, the beginnings of what it seems like these eight guys, whatever, sensed the possibilities of tech, not only in its like monetization thing, but its control thing. And I think that's part of what I wanted to say, to kind of move the conversation forward a little bit into this territory of like mystery, because we mentioned X Files, but like the movie sort of resonates with that. There's no UFOs here. I was waiting for the aliens or something. They're not here. But it's always sort of like in the background to me is this sort of like mystical element because, you mentioned like the kind of like, I don't know, the universe, the sort of mystical understanding of the universe and like what we are. But we can't even understand the reality of these eight guys. Like in other words, the reality is unknowable just on a human level, let alone on a universe level of what's going on. And I think that's part of what is sort of frustrating about mainstream politics in some sense. It's an attempt to sort of like wrestle the world into a kind of knowable shape, so that we can make this policy decisions. And that's like a very messy process in part because we're wrangling the mystery. And there's like, I don't know, these guys, there's something about all of these conspiracy dudes, especially like that Robert Booth, Nichols guy, but others that really they're creepy. There's something alien about them. There's something that, in other words, part of the true crime narrative drive is also the alien drive. It's also the kind of like universal drive, like touching this conspiracy, touching whoever killed JFK and all the shadowy figures is also touching the UFO thing in some way. I think that's part of what, like when I was 14 years old, I didn't know much about any of this stuff. But when X Files debuted and they said this is a show where like FBI people are investigating the JFK murders and like UFOs, I'm like locked in. That was my shit. You know what I mean? Like that, and that's part of the nostalgia trap that this movie is tapping into. These pieces of the puzzle are the way that we, I don't know, try to understand the mystery. And I think that's part of what makes this movie so compelling.
Yeah, that's well said. And I think part of what I understand you to be saying is that there's something unknowable about the very forces that make up our government, and by extension, our society, the country that we have, this nation, the United States. It's a
And the
cipher.
JFK assassination seems like a key, like, I don't know, sight into all of that. Like that, it seems
Right.
like that for our generation, for better or worse, that's the way we sort of understand some sort of shadowy power that none of us understand. And I think that leaves a hole in like the American population in some way. It's weird because it seems like a key moment.
But in some ways, I don't think it is anymore, but I think it is for our generation, and I think that
Yeah.
that's why it's a nostalgia trap, and we're the children of the folks who witnessed it, Like our parents were witnesses to the assassination. You
Maybe
know,
9/11 focuses functions that way for a younger generation.
maybe, but though that generation is not that far behind us anymore. And my students were babies, most of them, when 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
So it's even that. I mean, if anything, the cosmic event is COVID for the kids that are
Well, I
coming up
mean, neither
now.
one of you and I were not around when JFK was assassinated. In fact, we weren't born until long, long after JFK was assassinated, and yet it still hangs over. Partly, maybe it's the Oliver Stone movie. Like the '90s had a lot of JFK, and that's partly, I think, why the JFK murders. Of course, we heard it from our parents. The boomers were like obsessed with it. It was in culture a lot. The Oliver Stone movie came out, and 9/11 happened not long after the Oliver Stone movie came out. In other words, we were already primed to sort of see that there's some bullshit going on. I don't believe whatever the stories are. I mean, and that's part of what this movie touches on without getting into any MAGA stuff at all. This movie is touching on the idea that you can fall down the rabbit hole and not believe anything anymore because of these events. Like these events have skewed reality for a lot of people.
Yeah, and that's something that Christian talks about is the way that reality has been skewed for him and how you, in some ways, you can't go back. You can make a choice about what kind of life you want to live, but once you've learned certain things, you can't actually
Eat the Matrix steak.
unsee them. Yeah, you can still choose. I would also say, look, if you look at Kennedy and 9/11, though, they're epic defining events and they are fractures in how we make knowledge, but they're actually fundamentally different things. They're way different stories. And the the shooting down of the Camelot president and like the cover up at the closest ranks around him, and the lie that the government tells the people, which is kind of it's an identifiable fiction in many respects. Like there are certain aspects of the narrative that are deeply flawed, and majorities of people consistently challenge the official narratives, including the government itself, which later came back in the 70s and said, yeah, it couldn't have just been a single shooter, And so 9/11, by contrast, there's conspiracies that roll around it, but the official government narrative is mostly true. And the parts that were excised were to protect the Saudis, which we talked about in our 9/11 trilogy. And while there's like subtleties that have been covered up, the kind of the basic facts of the conspiracy are really hard to produce. The inside job doesn't really work that well. It's a belief system as opposed to evidence that you could push forward in a criminal trial. And whereas Kennedy is the opposite of that. And Kennedy, you have a single person who not only is president, but it's the Camelot president. It's Jack
Mm,
Kennedy,
mm.
Irish Catholic senator from Massachusetts, all the things that go with that mythology. 9/11, it's really weird. All those people died, and it's really hard to put a face on the tragedy. You don't associate it with any one person. And that there's a sprawlingness to it. So, like,
That's
Flight
right.
93 is a big part of the story. The
There isn't
NYPD,
one victim of 9/11. That's interesting. I can't name a
yeah, and
single,
well,
like,
the one person associated with it is dead, Osama bin Laden. So
yeah.
bin Laden becomes the Kennedy of 9/11, and so all the attention is put on the villain, not the hero.
Jesus,
So
yeah.
the tragedy has too many victims to individualize, and so there's not as much story there for the young ones to grapple with. And remember, Stone did a 9/11 movie too, and it bombed.
That's
And
right.
so, there part of the reason why the 90s has the Kennedy stuff sells books, dude, like World War II biblical level sales. Like Kennedy finds
Oh,
an
yeah.
audience. 9/11, there's no audience for it. No one continually reads new books that are trying to re-narrate
No,
9/11.
it seems really old.
9/11 doesn't sell. It's not
Yeah.
marketable. It doesn't push through the culture. It's just a completely different sort of story. But I don't think any of this negates the general theme of what you're saying in terms of aliens and our belief systems and everything else. Because what I ultimately know you'd be saying is that our belief systems themselves are fractured, and that we observe and feel those fractures in our politics every day. And then aliens kind of stands behind that, kind of figuratively and metaphorically, and sometimes literally, depending on the show.
Well, I mean, the thing is, there are so many, I think it's two things. There are so many elements to these stories that you hear and that I read that I'm familiar with that I'm like, from reading Chaos to all of our 9/11 and JFK episodes, I sort of accept that a lot of this stuff is true. The other element of it is that like I've experienced my own, you and I have talked about our own sort of like quasi mystical sort of experiences over the years that we don't really necessarily categorize into any particular ideology or spirituality, but yet, I have to admit that like synchronicities and intuition and weird things have shaped my life in a lot of profound ways, honestly. And I know you and I will talk about the new season of True Detective soon,
Mm-hmm.
in which sort of like,
Fits into
they're
this so well.
yeah, they get into a lot of these conspiracy ideas, but also communication with the dead and the sort of notion that there's a kind of magical reality that you can gauge in. And I think that's part of what this movie is demonstrating without getting into it like explicitly. There is kind of magical reality to the octopus conspiracy. They're kind of like they are controlling events and they are pulling off mysterious things that seem impossible. And yet, I have no doubt that these guys are actually real. It's funny that there's also like that there's a game element to what they're doing. They're sort of like, they seem like they're playing a little bit. I don't know. One thing that I wanted to get your reaction on, and speaking of the JFK conspiracy, is there's a moment in this movie that a woman, a journalist, talks about seeing the Zapruder
Sherry
film.
Seymour,
Yeah, and she sees a version of it that Nichols shows her. This Robert Booth Nichols, this like vampire figure.
the smoking man guy.
Yes, who like she goes to his apartment and she's like, this apartment is a safe house. This was like some fucked up weird like set, like movie set of an apartment. And there was a stuffed lion next to her as she was told there would be that like was a recording device. And this guy's having a conversation with her. And at the end of the conversation, he pulls down a movie screen and is like, check this out. And he shows her the Zabruder film. And she's like, okay. He's showing me the JFK
Super
assassination.
slow.
Yeah. And then it's like this super slow motion of like the driver of the limousine that JFK is in pulling out a gun and leaning back. And like you can see the bullet coming out of the gun and him like blowing JFK's head off. And in the same frames that you usually see something else happen. And then he shows her the original version and he says, this is the version that you've probably seen. Like this is the like version that was given to the people, in other words. That's a moment that, I've been looking at JFK stuff for a long time. I've never heard that conspiracy, and yet I looked it up and there's people who do discuss it. And they do like actually talk about the actual limo driver named William Greer, who was
Secret Service agent.
yeah, or Secret Service agent. Who fucking knows? But that was a creepy moment, dude. What was your reaction? Had you heard that before?
I had not heard of it before, and the part I found most memorable actually was in the Zapruder film that uh, was the one that was supposedly doctored by the CIA before it was released. That the tree was floating above the wall
Yes.
because they fucked up on the background, and
Yeah.
that I mean maybe want to go look at the Zapruder film and see if I can find that tree. I didn't know what they were showing me when they were showing me that. I was like, is that really what the Zapruder film looks like?
Yeah.
You know me, dude. I'm one of those people, and as I said on our JFK show, number one, I thought Oswald was there pulling the trigger. He's not a communist. He's associated with all these right wing fascist militia type guys in New Orleans, etc. He was part of a communist kind of cut out front identity. But I don't deny that he was up there in that book depository firing off some shots from that rifle. None of that
Oh
to
yeah.
me negates his patsy rhetoric. I've always wondered where the other shots were coming from. Were they coming from the grassy knoll? So the idea that the driver turned around and did it, well, that certainly explains the headshot aspect of it. So I'm like open minded to it. I don't necessarily immediately believe it, but I don't immediately discount it either. And if the thing is, you can kind of come up with some quick counterclaims. Like if the driver did it, was Jackie just not looking? You know
Yeah,
what I mean?
right.
That,
Yeah.
like if
Nobody
the
saw
driver
this.
did it, no one else saw it. If the film was doctored in that way, it's never been
Justin,
released.
they had very early versions of cloaking devices, I think, that in which they could sort of like bend reality in live action like that. I don't know. I mean, every revelation is more wild than the next in some ways, and that's part of what I think this movie is sort of playing with, the idea that you can just get teased by like these pieces of the puzzle. I mean, the sort of like the guys doing the Indian casino stuff who are like, I mean, that part of it gets into, I think, something you and I have talked about a lot, and you send me screenshots about this sort of thing all the time, which is like the connection between like U.S. government, law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and then like cartels, the drug world, and then like the mob world, the organized crime world, and those elements have like a global sort of piece to them
Yeah.
that this movie is sort of touching on, and that part of it I really appreciated because again, like I love that this movie doesn't really settle on one side or the other in terms of like, oh, be careful, be wary of yourself, like getting into these crazy conspiracy theories because they're true, and that part of it, like that dialectic, I think is really something that's very recognizable to me, honestly, because I could very easily be sucked down the rabbit hole, and we live in a country that is totally rabbit hole at this point. Like whenever I hear people talking about conspiracies now, it's usually vaccine oriented, honestly. And I think of it as like MAGA. And that's an interesting twist because I think you and I, Justin, grew up in part in this nostalgic Cold War sort of conspiracy JFK alien world with a feeling that was often like kind of like lefty or progressive people or something that were into that. But no, like now I think of conspiracy as like pretty solidly right wing. Maybe that was my mistake because the John Birch Society was always around and there's always been a sort of right wing crypto sort of conspiracy sort of angle on it. But it's interesting. I guess that was my own entryway into it. Like my own entryway was sort of into understanding like how these forces, were involved in being the architects of the Vietnam War and the sort of like right wing connection to the Nixon administration and that sort of thing. So I don't know. It to me like there's something so intense about the idea that there really are these forces working in our society, and yeah, it'll drive you crazy if you try to understand them.
I think one of the things that strikes me along the lines of the reflections you're making is that the period in which we associate most with CIA covert operations and overthrow of governments, which stretches from Guatemala and Iran in the 50s and earlier, of course, but those are two of the signal ones to Chile in
Mm-hmm.
71 with the assassination of Allende. But up through the Contras and all that stuff is that you really are still dealing with the same guys that were in the OSS during World War II and who were out there, you know, fighting Nazis and then bringing the Nazis back home. Like that's the group of guys and their kids. They're all in charge of shit. And if you look at the governments that were in charge then, like Eisenhower and then LBJ, who's kind of like not really not part of that. Him and Nixon are from different parties, but in terms of foreign policy, they have very similar designs on how to perpetuate U.S. capital in Asia. And then you have Ford, and then you have like a little baby term of Carter, which is kind of a neutered term. And then you get 12 years of Reagan Bush rule. And what I find really interesting is that those Reagan Bush years are like Eisenhower years, Nixon years. These are years where the CIA is still running covert operations in which, those things that we associate with classic stories of cartels, drug dealing and distribution for black ops, but also just for profits, and then the money laundering and the banks like the BCCI, et cetera. Those things are running around in the 80s in a similar way that they were working in the 70s, 60s, 50s, and 40s. It's the same basic network of guys, and a lot of them are still alive. A lot of them are in and out of government, kind of running these operations. They don't need to control governments. They don't even really need to control all the wars. They need to control enough of the machine that the capital flows to them and to their families and to their patrons and to their clients, to their way of the world. What happens when Clinton comes in is that, Perot fucks up the 92 election. Bush should have been reelected. You take Perot out, Clinton never wins.
Hmm.
Clinton has a plurality. If the Perot votes went to Bush, Bush is reelected. That's a different world. And so when Clinton comes in,
How
you
ironic that a Texas millionaire spoils it for
yeah, yeah.
George
And,
Bush.
and then what happens, remember, is the Supreme Court gives the 2000 election to Bush. And that becomes this. That's where me and you are kind of coming into conspiracy politics post 9/11.
Right. It was all
And
Republican Party stuff.
right. And it's a really clear genetic, and I mean that literally, genetic and cultural and political and economic burst of fresh air from the 80s Reagan Bush years. It's Bush too. It's Iraq too. And you have 9/11, which and for all the things that it did or didn't do, one of the things we've always been clear on is it made a lot of people a lot of fucking money, which fits the profile. Not saying it was an inside job. I'm just saying the wars that were created in its name fit a lot of the kind of Contra-esque logics that we saw happening in the 80s. The whole point that I'm driving to, though,
Never
is,
let a crisis go to waste.
but the whole point I'm driving to is Obama comes in, and for all that he didn't do, like fucking Guantanamo Bay still exists, motherfucker, but like for all that he didn't do, he sort of slowly starts changing CIA. Because when you look at CIA in the 21st century, and when you look at National Security Council, when you look at the people that were arrested out of the Reagan Justice Department, like a lot of these guys that are in the documentary that were kind of moving drugs and working with the cartels, a lot of them were caught. Not all of them, but a lot of them were caught. You don't have people going away to prison like that anymore. So either you have to kind of think two things about life in the 21st century, from Obama to Trump to Biden. Either these things are all now happening at a level that's really successful, because these things were happening for 70 years after 1945.
Yeah.
And every generation, every political administration had some version of guys getting caught with their pants down with the drug cartels, with banking, with laundering, with drugs, with illegal wars, etc. We saw some of this kind of warfare go above board in Iraq, Afghanistan. Fine. What's happening now? Name me the last guy that was arrested the way that the guy from the Justice Department, I think that guy Abel, who was stopping investigations into the Kali cartel because he was helping them launder money, because the Kali money was kind of like CIA money, and the FBI couldn't prosecute and DEA had its hands off. These guys were doing kind of crazy, nutty, obvious shit. We don't have stories like that anymore. So when you talk about vaccines, when you talk about COVID conspiracies, when you talk about MAGA conspiracies, when you talk about this, like the rightward shift of the conspiracies from below, just the last thing I would say to that is, for that whole period, you had a lot of right-wing people like running government agencies for their own selfish profits, fighting socialism and communism, in addition to everything else, keeping the world safe for capitalism. Capitalism fucking won after 91, after 89. And the liberals who kind of started to run government, starting with Clinton in 92, kind of more or less found a way to run the show, with the exception being the Trump years, which, we can talk about that at some other show. But the kind of liberals have been in charge. And so a lot of the conspiracy energy is coming from the right and from below, and in part because the real right-wing fascist types, who these smoking ban people are, all these agency operatives, these motherfuckers, like
they're old school.
Robert Booth Nichols, these guys were the ones in charge. Are they still around?
They're a throwback.
The government, in a weird way, it's like there's less. I'm not saying the government's less fascist, but there's less nefarious, fucked up fascists in some of these agencies. In a weird way, they've been professionalized by liberals.
They're like Dr. Strangelove guys.
Yeah.
Don't exist anymore.
Or if they do, where the fuck are they? And that's the open question right now as this documentary ends. We're seeing all these stories getting their kind of the loose ends tied up from the fucking 20th century. What the fuck is going on with the 21st century? Because
where are those?
These are Cold War lives, dude. These are Cold War lives.
You know what the attitude is? That clip that I sent you that we laugh about from A Few Good Men, where Jack Nicholson is like yelling at Tom Cruise and calling him like a liberal cuck pussy, and saying like, like, you want me on that line, you need me on that line. Like, the one word he's like, I can't do the whole speech, but he basically says, son, we live in a nation, or a world of nations, and those nations have borders, and those borders have walls, and those walls are guarded by men with guns. It's like, I'm sorry, they're like, we have to do things that you don't like to talk about at your polite Washington parties. He just calls him a little bitch essentially and tells him that like that attitude, that like strange Lovian Cold War, we do what we need to do for America. You're right. Like, where is that? Like, I don't even see it in Trump, really. Like, Trump doesn't seem to have that sort of like, he calls to it a little bit, but like that sort of John Wayne attitude, it does come up in this film. I thought it was interesting. You mentioned like the generational element. They track down this guy, Coulier, that
Who
he's
I
probably
think
the
is
guy that may have killed Danny Casolaro. This like
strongly suggested by the doc.
yeah, this like scary CIA dude. They track down his son, and when they get his son on the phone, his son is like, "Oh, just so you know, before we get started, I hope everything is in a positive light because everything my father did, he did for his country, and he did like we had to do what we had to do." And like, there's sort of like this notion, like even among this younger guy, the younger generation, that like, yeah, we had to do what we had to do to fight the commies. And I have to say, like, I've heard a few young people around me that I've talked politics with a little bit. And there is a kind of like, there is still sort of like an anti socialist or anti communist sort of strain, even among young people, that's like, if they think about history, they're like, we had to do what we had to do to squash that shit. And it's sort of like, dude, that's there. And it's part of like Danny Casolaro. If he was murdered by forces that felt that way, that felt that they were essentially fighting communists by killing this guy because he knew too much.
Or that was a pretext that the socialist boogeyman was put out there as the so-called national interest discourse that was really protecting their very hardcore capitalist operations.
It's interesting because this is okay. So in my book Dangerous Grounds about GI coffee houses, one of the things that happens in that book that's part of the whole GI coffee house story is investigations by essentially like the skeleton of HUAC. Like in the late 1960s, the organizations most associated with like McCarthyism in the 50s had not, it wasn't even called HUAC anymore. It was called like the Armed Services. It had been reduced in its power. And it was still using language like about Marxism and communism that seemed very dated in 1969 and 1970. And when Congress is like holding these investigations, there are like some old dinosaurs in Congress who are talking about commies infiltrating our water supply. They sound like the Strangelove guys. So it's interesting to me that those sort of nostalgia trap of like CIA crypto politics, because this movie does sort of like play with it. It's an old story. Like the Danny Casolaro murder happened more than 30 years ago, and that part of it, it was already, I don't know, it's part of a weird cultural moment, I think, that happens in the 90s in which that stuff seems to pass and we come into a different sort of like right wing politics, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's the end of communism, the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, to various degrees, I get that. Yeah, I actually caught that. He's murdered in Martinsburg, West Virginia, which is where 1877 general strike kicks off in terms of its violence.
Nice. Wow.
That's where the first bodies fell. And if you remember, the strikers were called communists, and there was a enormous Red Scare produced around that general strike to discredit the claims made by the workers and their families about starvation and poverty. And they were all discredited or attempted to be discredited as communists. And so, like
Yeah, this is
the
another
weird way that
capitalism versus
Mhm.
communism story. And if
in Martinsburg,
yeah, and if you notice
hmm
that, like, they mentioned it several times, and it made me, I guess, sort of reminded me that in the '80s, people like Reagan and Bush, when they talked about like Cold War and the struggle in the world, the global struggle, they talked a bit about it as between communism uh and freedom. Like they
hmm
didn't say communism versus capitalism, but this
hmm
movie seems like it's very much tracking communism versus capitalism, and it's sort of
hmm
like Danny Casolaro as collateral damage, perhaps. I mean, the other element, and I think you and I would entertain it as well, and so do the main guys. You have to. Maybe he just killed himself. Maybe like, and that doesn't really change the story much, honestly. It's still like he was still destroyed by this one way or the other.
Yeah, I'll spoil the plot and just say two things mediate against that for me personally. One, 12 deep cuts to both wrists, including the tendons. Once you cut your tendons, you can't move your hand. So
Doesn't
like,
seem possible. Yeah.
yeah, that's pretty intense. That's not, and
And
also you don't,
a woman saw a guy enter his room as well. That's a
yeah.
pretty big bombshell.
Well, yeah, that's the bombshell. And I also think that those horizontal cuts on your wrist, those are the ones they tell you not to make. Those are the false cuts. You got to make vertical cuts along your wrist because you got to open up the entire vein or the entire artery. The,
Mm.
the the horizontal cuts are not the way that they would tell you to do it. So not that I am suggesting that or I don't want to anyway. So then yeah, when the woman talked to the composite artist who produces a drawing that looks like Quaylar, that was all I needed as far as corroboration. And then what makes that even deeper was that the people that saw witnesses with Danny in the lobby and going into his room with the key, those witnesses were buried in the official reports. And then when they wanted to talk to the Martinsburg police chief at the press conference, they all fucking walked out of the news
That
conference.
was disturbing to watch,
That's
actually.
all deeply suggestive of people who are unable to answer basic questions, which means I think the official narrative to me has very little credibility at this point. Uh,
Ugh.
you know, he 100%. Okay, I don't want to get sued for libel or slander.
Dude,
I'm a little worried about that Quaylar guy and his kid.
I mean,
But
what do you think?
the narrative strongly suggests it was not suicide. Let me frame it that way.
Okay, so let's wrap it up. I did want to mention though, because there are lots of different perspectives on that. What did you think of the main another main character of this film, his brother? Because I thought he was a very credible sort of witness and figure, and he's one that was a really interesting entryway into the story. I really
Yeah,
appreciated his presence.
me and you, we trade some of the grief memes,
Yeah,
and one of the things that stuck with me is that he was extremely. I thought he was quite credible, and really loved his brother. The people that were around Danny really loved him, his friends and his family. And then when they were asking him about some version of Danny's descent, if you will, into this story. He was literally consumed by the story, something that is very much a trap theme. And the loss, this idea that he was murdered, and how he admits for a time that he believed the official narrative, but seemed to be kind of in a state of continuous or ever more disbelief above the official narrative of suicide. He was lied to by the Martinsburg police. He was lied to by the Justice Department under Janet Reno, et cetera. The thing that stuck with me is when he said, "You don't get over certain losses; time passes."
yeah,
That to me is so true. That is so true. It's something that me and you have traded. That I think he is one of the people in the story that has very little motive to lie, and that his honesty is captured through claims like that. And that
yeah,
was one of the claims that really stuck with me about this entire 4 episodes. That'll cut through the conspiracy any day of the week.
yeah, and
At bottom, Danny was a good guy who his life was unfairly ended, and the people that loved him still love him and miss him.
yeah, and that connection is, I thought, really intriguing in terms of the connection between actually losing him and his death and the grief of it, and also like the anger and sort of mystery and the not knowing what actually happened to him. Because I found it very identifiable, and I feel like maybe I would be the same way. It seemed like it maybe was a little reckless, maybe not, but part of it was his grief. But like the brother, like right when this happened, all those clips of him like with a beard when he's younger, uh, right when his brother was killed or died, he went to the media and was just like spilling the beans. Was just like, look, I don't believe it. I don't really believe that this was a suicide, and no one else does, because he told me just 3 weeks ago that he was like on the trail of some hot shit, and that it was scary to him, and that if he died accidentally, it wouldn't be an accident. So like, it's very obvious to me that something just happened. He didn't commit suicide, and that part of it, like him actually going to the press and like talking to the media, I was sort of cringing, sort of like in parts. I'm like, he's making a lot of reckless, like libelous statements about what might have happened here, but he didn't name names really, I don't think. But it seemed like he understood a little bit about like the Promise Software thing and like a little bit of like the outline of what Danny was onto. But this movie is really at heart. There's a lot of different emotions that it's pulling at, but it's also a really scary movie. In part because this younger journalist Christian, he hesitates, and I understand for a long time he hesitates to actually engage with this. It's like, to me, like, would you and I want to start like writing letters and visiting like churches of Scientology and like trying to investigate them? Would we want to do that? I'm like, no. In
Or
part,
if me and you started trying to cover one of the major Mexican cartels, just
right?
shitting on them.
Yes, yes. And I'm like, that's scary to me. I don't. I like want to be as anonymous as possible when it comes to that sort of stuff. And this movie is, whether he killed himself or not. And I think you're right. I lean hard on the fact that he was murdered. But either way, there's a hard sort of danger to engaging with these worlds. And yeah, I've read about people who engage in Scientology. Not only are they litigious, they're like, they have their own law school. They crank out lawyers that like just will do restraining orders. They'll get into your
Expensive as
finances.
shit.
They'll sue you into bankruptcy and will never, like, they'll just relentlessly pursue you legally until you're just destroyed. But they engage in quasi illegal practices of harassment and abuse. Dude, who would invite that? Like, I don't need to know that much.
Dude, it'd be like if I was like, dude, let's start up an entire podcast on the Juarez cartel where we just like bring in fucking people to talk about like how devastating this cartel. Dude.
Yeah, dude, no thank you. Do what you want, guys. I'm just reading books here and watching Netflix documentaries about it. I'll let those other guys consume themselves. But, like we've said, you and I are kind of partly this. And I think that's what made this sort of a fun and disturbing watch. So I wanted to let Nostalgia Trap listeners know that this film, American Conspiracy, The Octopus Murders, is out there, and I think worth your time. It gets into a lot of this stuff. So thanks, Justin. I appreciate talking about it with you.
All right. Thank you. Same.